it's much more powerful and convenient to think about the world not in terms of little things that do stuff, but in terms of processes and nets of processes.
I rather like Carlo's rock. I think it exists independently of us, and it exists no matter what the underlying physics of the world is.
And I think that we should take ordinary objects seriously, and that some of the really interesting questions in this region come in trying to understand how our descriptions in fundamental physics terms relate to the kinds of descriptions that we have in terms of ordinary objects, and perhaps levels in between.
It's just a mistake to think that physics can be seen as aiming for that kind of view from nowhere, the God's eye perspective. There is no such thing. The ultimate description will be a relational one.
Well, thank you for joining us in Heraclitus' dream if you're English, and Heraclitus' dream if you're not English. Take your pick. Most of the objects we see around ourselves, from tables to stars, appears to be a world of things which are stable and fixed. They don't do things, they just sit there. And yet, quantum physics and the ancient philosopher Heraclitus felt that actually nothing remains the same, that the world of stable objects might be an illusion, not the best way of understanding it. Might the world be essentially fluid, a series of processes? To help us get at this possible heresy, we have our four panelists. We have, on my far right there, Carlo Rovelli, something of a superstar in Italian science. Your recent book, 30,000 copies, is that right? Astonishing. Wait till it gets published in English. Is a theoretical physicist who's pioneered loop quantum gravity. That's how bad things are getting, folks. And formulated relational quantum mechanics. And his books include What Time Is, What Is Space? Daniel Stoljar, Professor of Philosophy at the Australian National University, and Philosophy of Mind editor of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I bet that gets you in a lot of trouble. On my left, Eleanor Knox is a philosopher of science, is the Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow at King's College London, and her work focuses on philosophy of space-time physics and their explanations and intertheoretic relations. I still don't know what that is yet. And Huw Price, Bertrand Russell Professor of Philosophy at Trinity in Cambridge, and the founder of the Centre for Time and co-founded the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, and I think we're all at that risk this afternoon. The question is, might the world be essentially fluid? Can I start with you, Carlo?
I don't like fluid very much, so let me start like all scientists to reformulate the question.
Please.
Is the question made of things? And this is a prototype of a thing. So it's solid, it has more or less sharp boundaries, it persists through times, and there's a tradition in common thinking, metaphysics, science, that the world is made by things. This, a mountain, a table. Of course, there are things. Here's one, okay? The question I want to ask is this the best way of thinking about the world? Science is supposed to tell us more precise way of thinking about the world, that make it more sense, glue things together. So to do that, to continue the scientific enterprise, do we have to think that the world is made by things like that, with all these properties that have a name, that are independent, whether I look or don't look or anything else? And my answer is no. The best description that, as far as we know now, we can give about the world is achieved if we forget. I'm not going to throw this because it's too, I was thinking of doing it, but it's having a small one. If we forget objects altogether and we use something else as the fundamental metaphysics of the world. Something else I may elaborate later. Just throw their processes, interactions, events, facts.
It seems to me that the answer to the question is yes, the world could be essentially fluid. But I think that doesn't in any way undermine the existence or nature of physical objects like Carlo's rock. I rather like Carlo's rock. I think it exists independently of us, and it exists no matter what the underlying physics of the world is. Of course, the underlying physics of the world is true, and it doesn't, as Carlo describes it, doesn't tell us that there are things rather like the rock. It tells us about very much stranger things. But the way that the world is according to fundamental physics, and the way that the world is according to our ordinary experience of it, as containing rocks and so on, these are compatible ways that the world can be. And what we can do is investigate the ways in which those two compatible stories coexist. And I think that's really where the hard questions in these areas of philosophy lie, and how to connect up these two apparently incompatible stories in such a way that we do justice to both. And it may be that those questions are in fact beyond us in a certain way, but nevertheless, those seem to be the key questions. So the point is, yes to the rock.
I was going to sort of agree with both of the previous opponents, but I'm not meant to agree. I agree with much of what's been said so far, actually, and along with the fact that words essentially and the words fluid are problematic. But I mean, my view on this is very much shared with Daniel in that I think that we should take ordinary objects seriously, and that some of the really interesting questions in this region come in trying to understand how our descriptions in fundamental physics terms relate to the kinds of descriptions that we have in terms of ordinary objects. And perhaps levels in between. Actually, I think I sort of like the fact the word fluid is sort of in this, because I think fluids are an interesting example. I mean, I think it's almost certainly the case the world's not essentially fluid. Why do I think that? Well, because I think fluids are fundamentally an emergent phenomena that happen when you reach a certain kind of level of description. I mean, the fluid in these glasses, we think ultimately there's a kind of discrete particle structure, and then we take a particular kind of interesting mathematical limit, at the continuum limit, and we get some very interesting dynamics coming out that are well describable as fluid dynamics. And that's the right level of description for a certain kind of view on the water. It's not the right level of description for a different kind of view of the water. And likewise, if we're trying to talk about what kinds of objects that turn out to be in fundamental physics, there are going to be appropriate concepts that we can try and find to grasp those, and they're highly unlikely to be the same concepts that were useful at the macroscopic world, the kind of things that we associate with ordinary objects, or the same concepts that, even a concept like fluid, perhaps. It's also a macroscopic concept. One word that some philosophers have very much like to use to try and get a handle on what kinds of things there are in fundamental physics is this word structure. That's a bit of a weasel word. No one really quite knows what it means, but at least it has perhaps the benefit of not coming with too many sort of previous bits of metaphysical baggage. So, I think we can very easily say that there aren't anything like everyday objects in fundamental physics. It's tempting to say that even in some relatively austere senses of object, so in the kind of language of logic, you have an object-predicate relation, and there are people playing with the idea that that's not the right language for fundamental physics. In some sense, our best access is mathematical language, and it just doesn't reflect the kind of traditional ways we've cast things into metaphysical categories. So we can explore that some more, perhaps. I mean, at another level of description, you might talk about processes, but I think that's very popular in biology. But I'm also not sure that that's the right descriptive level for fundamental physics. So perhaps my angle on this is rather a nuanced one. It's that, yes, there are objects. No, there aren't objects in fundamental physics. And what there are is going to depend very sensitively on the theory that we're dealing with and what kind of level of description we're talking about.
What I wanted to do was to put the debate in context a bit. I mean, we've got a debate which is named after Heraclitus, who thought famously is said to have said that everything is flux. There was that notion of flux, perhaps more than the physical notion of fluid, which is important here. And we've been hearing here ways in which physics seems to be putting pressure on the alternative view by putting pressure on the notion that there are things like objects at the fundamental level in the physical world, although they clearly are at the level of stones and tables. What I wanted to say is that the fact that physics puts pressure on the notion of object in that way, it may sound like good news for Heraclitus, but it's not really good news, because physics also puts pressure on the notion of flux, in particular because it puts pressure on the conception of time, which has flux at its core. It's not a universal view, but the widespread view is that the view of time we get from contemporary physics is one which was nicely expressed by the mathematician and physicist Hermann Weyl, who said the objective world simply is, it does not happen. Only to the gaze of my consciousness, Weyl said, crawling upwards along the world line of my body, does part of this world fleetingly come to life. So the point that Weyl was making is that the ordinary sense that we have of things changing is, in a sense, a mistaken one from the viewpoint of contemporary physics. The most fundamental view we have in contemporary physics is one in which there isn't change in that sense, in the sense that Heraclitus had in mind, at the level of fundamental physics. So the story here is, it's kind of lose-lose, I'm afraid, for Heraclitus' point of view.
Shall we at least try and pin down what we all mean by an object? Carlo, do you want to tell us what an object is and what it's not, where the boundaries are of an object?
Yeah, so I think the rock is a good example of what we might mean with an object or thing. But there's a number of features related to that. First is that it persists through time. This is the same rock as the one I showed you before. It's not another one. This is crucial part of the notion of a rock. And I think it's something that wants very much to disappear in fundamental physics. Second is solid. Okay, solidity is very part of the story. I think we all agree that saying that the world is fluid is a little bit silly, because fluids, we know fluids very well. We know they're made by atoms. So they are not fluids. They're but atoms in turn are made by fields that oscillate, have a wavy nature. So the solidity is an aspect which is not part of the atoms, and it's totally disappeared from the elementary description of the world. Third, we're made by some substance, and we think that an object is made by substance, but in fact the majority of the things we call objects are not made by substance, because substance goes through. I mean, I'm an object, but I keep eating and expelling things. And the prototypical object is a cloud on the top of a mountain, right, which is not a thing. It's air that goes through, water condensates, so it becomes... It reflects light more and then it goes away. So there isn't something remaining there. But nevertheless, we see it as a cloud, and we can call it cloud, and we can call it an object. But if we understand it better, we see that the object way of thinking is not the appropriate one for understanding it better. Which, of course, doesn't mean that we couldn't keep calling it an object. I don't think there is anything particularly mysterious on the fact that physics gives us a picture of the world which is different from the common ones. There's no contradiction between the common view of the world, it's a rock, solid, and a more detailed explanation we can get by doing science. And then the most important of all to me, which is that we think of an object as an entity which is a unit, which is in itself independent of how we view it. And I think this doesn't help to understand the world. We are not going to understand the world better, more, I don't want to say fundamentally, just a little better, in terms of individual things which have a solidity, which have a unity, which persist through times independent of us. I think that what we call objects are often ways some part of the world relate to us. So it's not that the stone stopped existing if I close my eyes, but it is true that if I look at a mountain, I call this the mountain, Mont Blanc in France, in Italy, okay? Is there a thing in the world which is a Mont Blanc? No, it's just a way that it relates to me. It's convenient for me to cut out a little part of the world and give it a name and make it in an object.
Daniel, are you willing to go along with the fact that we make objects by giving them a name?
No, I'm not willing to go along with that. I think that I think that there's an appearance of agreement here, but I think underneath there's quite a big disagreement about the status of ordinary objects, of which you gave a very nice description. And the crucial thing comes, I think, when we ask whether these objects exist independently of us. When I said before that there's two stories, there's the story from physics and then there's an ordinary story about physical objects and many other things too, and that we need to do justice to both of them, I meant that the do justice bit seriously. I meant that the two stories are both literally true. Now, it seems to me to be a crucial part of the ordinary story, of the story about ordinary physical objects, that physical objects exist and they exist independently of us. There is such a thing as Mont Blanc, and there it is, independent of us.
Sure.
And that's a fact. It's not just simply a projection of our understanding or something like that, or it doesn't somehow depend on us or anything of the sort. It exists independently of us, and that fact, since I take it to be a fact, is something that a total worldview has to accommodate, just as it has to accommodate the facts of physics. And so, in a way, the issue comes down to about your rock. The issue comes down to its status and how we can accommodate it.
Can I
ask a question, just a short question?
Yes, please, as long as it's short.
Do you think Liechtenstein exists independently of us, or just by itself, as an entity in the real world, independently? The country?
No, Liechtenstein, I think, is a social object which depends on us. It's like a club.
So what's the difference between Liechtenstein and Mont Blanc?
Well, I think if you try to climb Mont Blanc, it's much harder than climbing Liechtenstein.
No, I can
because you're going to run out of oxygen at certain points.
Right.
I think Liechtenstein is a place. There are most two places.
Oh, there's the region of Liechtenstein that exists independently of us.
And
but you mean the social object doesn't exist independently of us?
And the region, also the region Liechtenstein is 1 meter to the left, exists independently of us?
Yes, it does.
So then there's a lot of things that exist beyond what we...
There are a lot of things, yes, and we kind of... It may be, I think that there are more things than we tend to name. You mentioned naming as a crucial feature of an object.
So
actually, I disagree
your
with that.
notion of existence is more far away from the common one than mine.
Quite possibly. Can I bring it... Eleanor, what do you think? Who's further away from common reality out of these two?
I think I largely agree with Daniel, but I think... but I'm going to say something that then he probably will disagree with. But so what's the difference between Liechtenstein and Mont Blanc? I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, in what sense does one depend on us and the other not? Well, I mean, I think that there are lots of theories in the world. I think those theories can be true of the world. And I think that it's a remarkable and interesting fact that, for example, there are material science appropriate levels of description that have a lot of regularities. One of the reasons there are ordinary material objects like the rock is that the world is ordered in this way, such that there are levels of description where there are robust, reliable regularities we'd identify with rocks. Now, actually, there are robust, reliable regularities we can identify with Liechtenstein. What's the difference? Well, the difference is that particular set of regularities and description, it's, in a sense, it's not different in kind from the others. It's just that once you get up to the kind of the social or the political level of description, that level of description wouldn't exist without people. It's still a robust, interesting, objective fact about the world that we have that structure to it as well. So I don't think there is sort of as enormous a difference between Liechtenstein and the rock, and yet I think the rock is a kind of real object.
Huw, can I bring you, try and pick something that's in between rocks and Liechtenstein? I mean, what about something like a vortex in water? It has many of the things that you're saying it's in space, it has duration, but is it an object?
Could I not answer that question,
okay.
but offer a different analogy which might help to throw some light on the difference of opinion between Carlo and Daniel. Not an example of an object, an example of a property. Think of colors. I think it's fair to say that until perhaps the 17th century or so, our ancestors simply took for granted that colors were perfectly objective features of reality. What we now know is that the story is much more subtle than that. We can still think of them as out there in the world if we want to. We can still say that these curtains were blue before any of us came into the room. But what we're saying is something which in some sense, it may be a difficult sense to elucidate, but we know it's there. There's an anthropocentric element to it. We know that the fact that we classify the world in this way depends on the particular kind of color vision we have, among other things. Now, I think Carlo's view, in the case of even of the kinds of objects we find in fundamental physics, is that something like that is true even at the fundamental level.
That's right.
Well, I mean,
but he didn't just say that then, right? He didn't.
Well, but he's a philosopher who speaks much better than me. I'm just a poor physicist. I write equations.
The naming problem of saying, well, we give it a name and therefore it gives it a unity, surely that also applies to things that we might say it's a process. So, in other words, a wave or the vortex. Is that an object?
Yeah, I think
we have the same naming problem, don't we? I'm saying that there's a vortex. Yeah. But even if we have the naming problem, surely is there a difference between the rock and the vortex? They both have many things in common, but viscerally they seem quite different as well. You can put a rock in your pocket and walk away. You can't do that with a vortex.
It's hard to do it with a cloud on top of a mountain.
Well, also that one, yes.
So I took it, the part of the point of Carlo's example was that the boundary between things which we intuitively think of as processes like the vortex and things we think of as objects, it's much more of a if I could use the expression, a fluid line than the ordinary notion of an object suggests to us.
Right. What does is fundamental physics saying, look, we've got the answer and you need to change your mind?
To some extent, yes. To some extent, no. First of all, let me stress again and again and again, fundamental physics is not saying at all that there are no colors, that there are no rocks, that this is wrong, that there is something wrong or illusory to say that. It's more complicated. It's just saying that you can get a better account of what happens if you change your way of thinking about things. You keep your way of thinking for rocks, and you don't have to think that this is a wave. But if you want to know why this color, why it's solid, if you want to compute how solid it is, if you want to know the story of that, at some point. And it is a trend in physics, this moving from object to processes. So I'm not saying the world is made by object, the world is not made by object, the world is fluid. I'm saying that according to quantum mechanics, astrophysics, material science, and many other sciences, it's much more powerful and convenient to think about the world not in terms of little things that do stuff, but in terms of processes and nets of processes.
I'm sorry?
Nets of processes. Right. And let me just add this. If you have a net, a fisherman net, you can describe it as a set of knots connected by strings. But this is a bit silly, right? It's not a set of knots connected to string. It's a string which is knotted here and there. And this is a knot. Okay. So this is a knot in the fabric of reality. What matters is the connection between this and the rest. And this is this is a metaphor, of course.
Well, is that this move from, say, objects to processes, that it emphasizes the connection between that
and anything else.
Whereas a world of objects, it does tend to be, here's an object doing its thing on its own, and there's another object doing a thing on its own. And it's a slight mystery when they interact.
Absolutely. Quantum mechanics is all about the fact, in my opinion, that the best way of describing an object is to describe the way it interacts with other objects.
Is there anyone who's going to take, have we shifted definitively from the world where we started of separate objects to one where it's a relation of processes sort of temporarily creating something? Or
I don't think we've shifted from one to the other. That sounds as if we've given one away, or we've decided that there's something second-rate or something questionable about ordinary physical objects. I don't think that's what's happened at all. I think what's happened, as Carlo says, is that to understand things better, you need perhaps to use a completely different conceptual framework. And that may be absolutely true. But it doesn't follow from that we've somehow moved away from ordinary physical objects. Ordinary physical objects still exist. There's still a difference between the cup and the table. It's just that there's another level of description. It's a bit like saying, the table is an object. It's made up of lots of things that aren't tables.
Right.
That doesn't tell you that there isn't a table, merely from the fact that it's made up of lots of things that aren't tables. So suppose that the things that make it up are processes, for example, or whatever else that is described. This does not in any way undermine the existence or nature of the table. It also doesn't move the table into the category of colours, as Huw was suggesting. It's true that colours are incredibly interesting because they have a very important connection to our perceptual processes and cognitive processes and so forth. And so then it is very puzzling how objects can be coloured. Colours seem sort of somehow dependent on us. But we do have notions of object already that are a bit like that. Like take my lap, for example. A cat can come and sit on my lap, which is a relation between a cat and my lap. But my lap is a very strange object. When I stand up, it vanishes. And when I sit down, it comes back into existence. It's a very strange object, and yet we can talk about it as an object and predicate properties of it and so forth. Right. It's a completely ordinary object, but it's a very strange one. So we already have a notion of a very strange kind of object, but this doesn't put under pressure our ordinary notion of tables and chairs and so forth. And it doesn't make us think that everything is rather like my lap. No. There's lots of things that are not like my lap, for example, the table.
But having those two levels of description, those two different ways, it does mean that we can say, well, what kind of a thing am I, for instance? Am I more a thing, like a rock, or am I a thing more like your lap? I'm here 1 minute and gone the next, which from a long perspective is sadly true. Do you think that Heraclitus was interested in this partly because of these other things which are object-like you, but aren't?
Yeah, so I think he was struck by the fact that the things that we talk about as if they were objects come in many different kinds. And he thought he was onto some sort of fundamental metaphysical distinction and could say something about on which side of the line reality lie. The case of furniture is an interesting one. I mean, on the one hand, philosophers sometimes talk about the furniture of reality as a metaphor for the stuff which isn't like Daniel's lap. It's the stuff which is supposed to be there independently of us. But it's a rather bad metaphor because furniture of all examples, I mean, what makes that a table is the fact that we put cups of water on it rather than sitting on it. Right. And so here I think I'm disagreeing with Daniel a bit. I think furniture is a classic example of a category of object which does have, which is in the sense I was talking about before, in an interesting sense, anthropocentric.
But can I ask you whether you are a thing or a process, or which is a better level of description for a human being, for a person?
This may be immodest, but I want to say I'm both. I think I'm, as Carlo said about himself, no, we're objects, but we're the kind of objects whose the sustenance of which is maintaining us over time requires a process.
Is this an important distinction, do you think? Was Heraclitus pointing us to something important, or just whiling away the hours?
So, I mean, I think that there are interesting things that we learn from, I mean, apart from thinking about contemporary physics, although I think we could learn them in other kinds of ways, and I think there's an interesting question about sort of, in as much as we've maintained our ordinary notion of object, what's been lost when you come to the kind of views that are being bandied around? And I think one of them is precisely this idea that there's a sort of neat object-process distinction. So one way you might think of the glass on the table or the table itself is a very traditional way to think about it. It's sort of atomistic conception. You thought that there were these things and then they were composed. There was perhaps some kind of privileged composition relation, that things could stand in with respect to one another, they would make a bigger thing. And there was a very particular idea of what thinghood was, and it partly involved this composition relation. That's still popular amongst some contemporary analytic metaphysicians. That's a view that you'll hear. And I think that one of the things that's coming out of this is that kind of view that really carves out a kind of a distinction, we can kind of give a neat metaphysical definition of what a thing is not particularly helpful here. A thing is a thing, an object, when we can talk about it as such and when it's useful to describe it as such, and there might be other terms in which it's more helpful to describe the same thing as a process, and I don't think that's it's a neat metaphysical distinction.
And can I ask you the same question I asked you? Do you think a person, a you in this case, is better described as a thing or a process?
I think it would depend on the context.
Oh.
Sorry.
What about you? Are you a thing or a process?
I think I'm probably a thing, but my life, I think, is an event or a process.
Okay. Carlo?
I'm a process, and no doubt. There's nothing thingy about me. Especially my thinking. I identify myself more with my body to the extent this body expresses my emotions, my thinking, my ideas. And would I think this more like a stone?
But
or
does that
more
mean
like something happening? I think of myself as something happening, not something being.
what we get back to is whether the distinction he was trying to draw was one that seemed fascinating a few thousand years ago in Greece, or whether we're at a place in modern physics where it's an important difference of description, this bringing in the idea of a process. It's not clear to me yet whether we think this is just an afternoon discussion or pointing at something
Can I formulate this manner? I mean, I'm a physicist here among philosophers. But I'm in the wrong, I think I'm in the wrong position here. I'm not here, I don't think a physicist is supposed to tell philosopher how the world is. To some extent, yes. I mean, philosophers better listen to physics because sometimes they're wrong ideas and physics help them to come out with this wrong idea. But the opposite process is what is more interesting for me and more important. I think somebody said that science doesn't take any step unless philosophy allows it to. And I believe it seriously. I mean, I don't think Heisenberg or Einstein or Newton would have done what they did scientifically unless they had some philosophical conception, mostly drawn from the philosophical environment around them, that permitted them to do so. I mean, quantum mechanics wouldn't have born with Heisenberg without the sort of positivism around him in which he was. So here, the question for me, I would find helpful if a philosopher told me physicist, not that, look, rocks are rocks. I know that rocks are rocks. I mean, don't tell us rocks are not rocks. We know that rocks are rocks. We all agree with that. But if they told me whether they think it's possible to elaborate and and use a fundamental description of the world, another description of the world, which might be more useful, besides, and stay together if you want with a common one, where we get rid entirely of things. For instance, I am strongly pushed by the physics I do to think of reality in terms of processes and interactive processes. Yeah. But can I think about interactive processes without first thinking something which interacts and therefore object? This is a kind of... I would like philosophers to help me to understand whether the worldview that physics is sort of suggesting is coherent or not.
So
it could be coherent or not.
I mean, so one thing that we haven't discussed much, which I think that's a view that many people have thought was particularly amenable to, say, loop quantum gravity or one of your own theories, is this sort of notion of structural realism, as it's called. So this idea that, as I say, it's a slightly hard idea to pin down, but I think the basic idea is that what there really are out there in the world is relations. Objects are rather secondary. And so really what the sort of fundamental metaphysics is and where physics is driving us, and somewhere that structural realists I think is an okay place to go, a metaphysically acceptable place to go, is that the world is fundamentally relational but not quite in the sense that you mean in relational quantum mechanics. I think
Can
it's
you tell
about
me what is relational? Is it the same thing as processes? We've just introduced a note. Where is it between things and processes, this relational?
Oh, so I think, well, a relation is just, taller than, a relation typically thought of as between two objects, though, and often as holding in virtue of properties of the two objects. Right. The structural realist move is to try and kind of flip that on its head and say that what's sort of metaphysically primary are the relations, these relational properties themselves, and not the kind of objects that stand in them. And that's, it's perhaps not entirely orthogonal to the process issue, but process comes with a kind of temporal baggage. The idea is that there's a time factor in here that we haven't been talking about very much. The process is something extended.
We had a tough time with that earlier.
Extended over time. I think the notion of a structure is agnostic with respect to that. A structure can be a four-dimensional structure, which is temporally extended, or you could have a three-dimensional structure or a higher dimensional structure. Right. But so the issue there is about, if you like, relations versus the things that stand in those relations, and which is primary. I don't know if you know much about this, Carlo, or whether you find it an appealing metaphysical view for your own physics. I
find it extraordinarily interesting. I don't want to here take position with it in favor or against. I certainly find it, and I find this is the kind of things that philosophy can offer to science, to physics in particular, and is where the dialogues work. Another major example is time. I mean, Huw was mentioning about a process is what is a thing in time is, and the physicists were very much confused about time. In fact, I think they still are a lot. I found the clarity that Huw brought about how to think about time quite remarkable in a way that physicists could have not done. So, of course, Huw's views on time were strongly influenced by physics, or taken by physics, but then made coherent in the way only philosophy can do. A physicist can, wave his hands, write equations, say this is a prediction. But what we want is not just predictions and equations. We want a coherent picture of reality of which we're happy with, which we may change tomorrow, and that's what philosophers can offer us. That limited sense.
I can sense you're not entirely happy with this disappearance of rocks.
Oh no, I don't like that. But but I do like Carlo's idea about philosophy playing a certain kind of conceptual role. I think it plays other roles too, but it does play that role. And Huw's work on time is a great example of that. Yeah. I'm not sure I agree with Eleanor that the idea of a relation or structure is that helpful in this context, mainly because there's just a worry that she said in passing that the crucial idea here is that somehow or other the objects are secondary to the relations. And it's very hard to make sense of that.
Do you feel that's not a wise move?
Well, it's just very, very difficult to make sense of that, because if a relation is a relation between two things. And so if a relation obtains, there must be two things in which it obtains.
So
the two things could be dramatically different from the way we ordinarily understand things. But nevertheless, there has to be, an x and a y such that x bears r to y. And other than that, it's very hard to see how appealing to relations will help with the problem that Carlo was pointing out, namely to try to show that a certain physical theory is coherent or not. Partly because it's unclear that that idea is coherent.
Right, we're sort of trapped by the language when we, relation, and it begs between two things.
Yeah. We're trapped by the logical framework, basically.
But is it just the logical framework, or also we trapped by some level of reality where there are things in it?
Well, one of the questions we're edging towards here, and I agree completely with Carlo that the interaction between physics and philosophy is extremely important and interesting. I think he was a little bit too generous in not pointing out that some of the best philosophers of physics are actually the physicists, not the philosophers, and people like Einstein or the Irish physicist John Bell in the quantum case. And they're the really outstanding philosophers of physics of the last 100 years. But there are some things that even the most brilliant physicists can't do in philosophy. So I think there are contributions which can come from philosophy. And some of them do involve language. And I think one of the crucial questions, which is tied up with the questions that Carlo himself wants to push and that he mentioned about whether we can have a description of the world which treats the entities, whatever we're calling them, as purely independent, or whether it needs to be more relational. And here there's a connection with Eleanor's point. I think that's deeply connected to issues in the philosophy of language about whether there can be such a thing as a view from nowhere, as philosophers sometimes say, a viewpoint which has none of the human in it, and nothing anthropocentric. Whether I mentioned colors earlier. I mentioned colors as an example of a category we use to describe the world which clearly is anthropocentric or relational, related to our own perspective. A deeply interesting question, in my view, is whether there's any viewpoint in the end which is not like that. And I think there are connections between Carlo's own view about the quantum world and an answer to that question which says no, it's just a mistake to think that physics can be seen as aiming for that kind of view from nowhere, the God's eye perspective. There is no such thing. The ultimate description will be a relational one.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for being here.